A&P1 students. In this video, we are going to cover the organic, the textbook uses the word biological molecules, macromolecules that are important in the human body. Now I'm going to go to our objectives, show you where they start. So we have already discussed this, but it's one of our objectives down here. You should know the difference between an organic molecule versus an inorganic molecule. So before we started talking about water, we mentioned that the inorganic molecules are those molecules that do not contain carbon, the carbon atom. So water and like sodium and calcium, those are all some examples of inorganic molecules. And then the organic molecules are the molecules that contain carbon and usually hydrogen too, but definitely the carbon atom. And so we're going to discuss the kind of main organic molecules that are in the human body. And if you look in and read the textbook, it's going to have a lot more information and details than I'm going to have you know for this class. So what I've provided for these last few objectives is the learning objective, and then I've given you below it the detailed information that you would need to know for each one of those objectives. So we have 30 of them here. So, so that way kind of clarifies what you need to know from that section of chapter 2. Okay, so the first learning objective, you need to know certain facts, information about each of the major classes of organic molecules or biological molecules. So the ones that you need to be familiar with is carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, and then ATP. And those will be the ones that the characteristics or the information that you need to know about them are going to be, you need to know which atoms form them. So remember we talked back when we were talking about covalent bonds, we were talking about how the covalent bonds are forming between atoms, mainly carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and they're forming these big, large macromolecules, organic ones. So it's the covalent bonds that are holding all those atoms together. So you should be familiar with exactly which atoms form these organic molecules. And then you should know some examples, and I put the examples here. The book might have other examples too, but these are the ones that I generally ask you about on the test, or I will ask you about on the test. And then the functions, and kind of just, a basic function of the different classes of organic molecules too. Okay, so we're going to start with carbohydrates, and I'm going to flip to the textbook. So this is in the section on biological macromolecules. They have carbohydrates. I kind of have them in a different order, but they have carbohydrates down here below the lipids. And they have this picture, which I think will help. So here's the picture showing the two types or examples of carbohydrates. And then in this picture, you can actually see what atoms are forming it. So that's one of the pieces of information you should know about carbohydrates is what atoms make up carbohydrates. And so it's carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So in this entire compound here, that is molecule, that is our 3 atoms, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And the examples are these two, glucose. And glucose is, it's also generally called the blood sugar. So it's this form, glucose is the form of the sugar that's in our blood, that's circulating in our blood. So we'll typically call it that. And the purpose or function of carbohydrates and essentially glucose, is to provide our cells with energy. So in between these little bonds, so we have all these covalent bonds that are holding all the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen together. When those bonds get broken, so something comes along, we'll talk about it, usually enzymes, they'll break the bond. And whenever a bond is broken, energy gets released from the breaking of that bond. So our cells can break these bonds in glucose, and whenever they do, the energy can be released and they can use it for work. So that's the glucose. So that's one example of the carbohydrates that you should be familiar with in the human body. And then the other one you should be familiar with is called glycogen. And essentially glycogen's same thing as glucose, except each of the glucose molecules, so each one of these is representing one of these. So what happens is sometimes our body needs a certain amount of sugar in the blood. So if we were to take a sample of our blood and check it for its glucose level, we'd want it in a certain range. So our body has those homeostatic control systems that keep it that way. So now sometimes we'll have too much glucose, and so what the body will do is take that extra glucose and store it in this form called glycogen, or this glycogen molecule. And so again, it just takes glucose molecules and bonds them together. And then this is mostly stored in the liver and then in the muscles of the body. So those are the primary places glycogen is found. And then if we ever need any sugar in our blood, kind of real quickly, then this glycogen will be broken down. They call it lysis, is kind of when you break bonds. So that's kind of the key word in this. And then glycogen, so it's just the breaking down of glycogen. So that'll happen, and then we'll get these. But then the part when we have plenty of glucose and we don't need that much, we'll store it. And so then there's this process where we generate more glycogen to form glycogen. So we can store it and use it for some time later when we need it. All right, so that is our information for the carbohydrates. So knowing carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are the atoms, glucose and glycogen are the examples, and they provide energy. I also, when I was talking about them, I also explained the relationship with glucose and glycogen. So that's down here in Objective 7. All right. So the next thing that we'll talk about is the lipids. So lipids, sometimes you'll hear them referred to as fats. And we'll head to and they're up here. I'll show you a picture of one. So they're quite a bit larger. So here's kind of a smaller picture, and then they showed a lot of details in it. So, but if you're looking at this picture, you'll notice that the atoms that compose lipids are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, just like the carbohydrates. So the difference is, though, that there's a lot less oxygen atoms in a lipid than there are in a carbohydrate. So the ratio of those atoms is different. So that's why, even though lipids and carbohydrates contain the same atoms, they are different because of the ratio of those atoms to each other. All right, so carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And then the examples. There's a lot of examples, but I picked these particular ones. So triglycerides, and that might be a word you've heard of before. A lot of times they'll be tested in your blood. If you ever have a blood sample taken, generally it's on the chemistry panel, they'll have like triglycerides. And they'll also have cholesterol, which most people are familiar with that one too. So those are examples of lipids. And then phospholipids are something we'll learn quite a bit about because they form the cell membrane or plasma membrane. So remember in lab, or at least this week in lab, we're talking about the cell, and we have you identify the the outer layer of the cell. It's called the cell membrane, or you can call it the plasma membrane. If we zoom in, look at the microscopic anatomy of that cell membrane or plasma membrane, you'll see that it's made up of phospholipids. And then there's a lot of other examples, but the last one I used was hormones. So some of our lipids in the body serve as hormones. So they would be released from a gland, and then they travel in the blood to tell another cell that it, needs to do something, so communicate to another cell. So when it comes to their functions, provides energy storage. That's mainly what the triglycerides do. So if we look at our fat stores in the body, the lipids that are stored in that fat are in the form of triglycerides. And then structure is the role the phospholipids play. The phospholipids are forming the cell membrane of every cell, so they have a role in structure. And then when it comes to the hormone, and cholesterol is also a component of cell membranes as well, so it also has a role in structure. And then hormones help with regulation, so they're regulating different processes. They're going to be released when something needs to be communicated to another part of the body, so they'll help regulate a process by another cell. And then protection, which makes sense. We have the fatty stores in certain areas, like around the heart and the kidney, and a little bit around our spinal cord, all places where it provides some cushiony protection too. So that's our lipids and what they're going to provide for us. And so I think what I'll do, because we just have a little bit more time in this video. The next video, I'm going to talk about proteins, nucleic acids, and ATP. And then we'll talk about proteins down here too. So that'll probably be our last video for this chapter 2. So I'll see you in the next video.